Much ado, let us forward to the topic. The condition is better termed as congenital hyperinsulinism. There was many terminologies which was used in the past, like idiopathic hypoglycemia of infancy, nesidioblastosis, persistent hyperinsulinemic hypoglycemia of infancy or PHHI, etc. Probably these are misnomers because it is not an idiopathic condition; it's a genetic condition. And nesidioblastosis is maybe a normal phenomenon in the early infancy also. It is not a disease of infancy because it continues to adolescent and even to adulthood. So probably the better terminology will be congenital hyperinsulinism. It is the most common cause of persistent hypoglycemia in infants, and why it is more important is because it results in it put the babies in a high risk of long-term morbidity. And it can occur both in persistent transient form that we will be dealing later. But first of all, whenever we talk about anything regarding hypoglycemia, there is always a conundrum of the cutoffs and the normal values. As you can see from the graph, probably there is no single abnormal value that we can dedicate or we can say that is applicable to all of the newborns. It's a very varying condition, and there is a normal range of glucose, and there is at some level there may be some neurological injury, and then symptoms start, and there are definite neurological injury, neural death happens. Generally, it is regarded as something less than 3 millimole per deciliter. That's approximately corresponds to something 50 or 55 milligram per deciliter. By around 47 milligram per deciliter, the neurological injury is documented to happen in some babies, not in all. And the symptoms can happen depending on the baby at any value less than 50 milligram per deciliter. And definitely by a very low value of less than 20, the neuronal death starts to happen. So various authors have recommended various cutoffs for the diagnosis of hypoglycemia, treatment of hypoglycemia, the threshold for treatment, etc., etc., etc. Unfortunately, I cannot offer anything concrete or anything new regarding these cutoffs. Various others are recommended cutoffs ranging from 35 to 55 or 65 being per deciliter as normal. But taking about a holistic or pragmatic view, especially in the first 48 hours of life, a 50 milligram per deciliter of plasma value may be considered as normal, below which it can be considered as abnormal. And the treatment initiation is done as per the routine. This is in normal babies, that those who are not in risk for hyperinsulinism. In those babies who are at a risk of hyperinsulinism, the cutoffs are slightly different that we will be dealing later. And again, many others or many institutions follow a threshold, treatment threshold as 40 milligram per deciliter, and then that depending upon the unit to unit variation. Coming to the congenital hyperinsulinism or hyperinsulinemic hypoglycemia, the incidence is something around 1 in 50,000 live birth, but in some countries where especially the consanguinity status is high, it's as high as 1 in 2,500, like in Saudi Arabia. A majority of these cases are due to mutations in the voltage-gated potassium channels, that is ABCC8 and KCNJ11. ABCC8 is ATP binding cassette, subfamily C, member 8. KCNJ means a voltage-gated potassium channel, subfamily J, and member 11. These are the genes that code for a specific voltage-gated channel that we will be dealing later. These include something around about half of the cases of congenital hyperinsulinism, but they constitute nearly more than 80% of the diazoxide unresponsive cases or more severe cases. And more than 50% of these unresponsive cases are focal forms, which has got some treatment implication, which we will be dealing later. So coming to the etiology or pathogenesis, the glucose or insulin secretion is mainly done in the pancreatic beta cells in a complex way. It's mainly dependent on the glucose level of the body. the glucose is the intake of glucose into beta cells is by GLUT2 transporters in a facilitated diffusion manner. Once inside the beta cells, this glucose can go into the glycolysis pathway, the glycogen synthesis pathway, and after glycolysis can move into the mitochondria for TCA cycle, anyway, thus producing ATPs. So there are one important enzyme, that is the glucokinase, which convert the glucose to glucose 6-phosphate, and PGMN, that is phosphoglucomanganese, which is an enzyme which is involved in glycolysis. So these defects can cause a decrease in the quantity of glucose 6-phosphate and resultant decrease in the ATP production. So whenever there is a good ATP production, when the ATP-ADP ratio increases, what will cause it closes this potassium channel, this voltage-gated potassium channel, which has got two subunits. One is KR6.2, that is inwardly rectifying potassium channel, and sulfonyl urea receptor 1. These are just two subunits of the same potassium channel. Once this channel closes and the potassium movement across the cell membrane stops, the membrane depolarizes. This depolarization causes the calcium influx into the cells, and this calcium ultimately leads to calcium-dependent exocytosis of the insulin. So this insulin secretion is under the calcium control. That's why in some cases of hyperinsulinism, calcium channel blockers are being tried. Your favorite drug, the diazoxide, acts on this potassium channel and makes it open, thus preventing the depolarization and resultant insulin secretion. That's about the glucose and its feedback control. But that's not only the things that controlling the insulin release. Various amino acids, especially the leucine and other amino acid, also stimulate the insulin release. That is mediated by a separate group of enzymes. One is short chain hydroxyacyl dehydrogenase enzyme, or HADH. Another one is glutamate dehydrogenase enzymes. So this glutamate dehydrogenase also takes part in the metabolism of ammonia. So whenever there is a defect in these two, again there will be excessive insulin release. And the GDH again recently to a hyperammonemia condition also. There is some other factors like hepatic nuclear factor 1A and 4A, which again has role in the insulin secretion and also in the function of the potassium cell. So a mutation of them again leads to hyperinsulinism. So once secreted, the insulin shows or acts, manifests its results. Primarily, it is an anabolic hormone. So it promotes the glucose uptake by muscle and adipocytes. It actively inhibits the lipolysis. That leads to your ketone bodies are a byproduct of the lipolysis. So whenever there is no lipolysis, there will be no ketone body production. That is important in this because ketone bodies are a favorite or important alternate fuel especially for the brain cells. So the brain cells are deprived of ketone bodies as alternate fuel in hyperinsulinism conditions. Insulin also actively inhibit glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Glucagon, the other hormone, actively stimulate the glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. That's why you generally get a good response to glucagon whenever you have a hyperinsulinism condition. So coming to the etiology, you can broadly divide the condition into congenital causes and perinatal stress-induced causes and some syndromic causes. There are many other classifications also, but this is simplified one. The congenital lesions are due to various mutations. The most important one is the potassium ATP-mediated potassium channel mutations. Again, the ABCC8 and KCNJ11. They encode in chromosome 11p50. So these are the most common mutation that is described. The glutamate dehydrogenase and glucokinase again leads to hyperinsulinism mutation. The hepatic nuclear factor 4A and 1A again leads to hyperinsulinism. This is a short chain hydroxyacyl dehydrogenase enzyme then the uncoupling proteins. The uncoupling proteins are proteins inside the mitochondria which are important for the TCA cycle, mitochondrial function, and then resulting ATP production. The SLC16A1 mutation produce exercise-induced hyperinsulinemia hypoglycemia, and phosphoglucomutase deficiency also produces. The perinatal stress-induced ones are important because they generally produces transient hyperinsulinism. The major stress results are intrauterine growth retardation, birth asphyxia, maternal preeclampsia, congenital heart diseases, MAS, and prematurity. So all these may lead to a hyperinsulinism condition, but probably transient. And there are some congenital syndromes with associated hyperinsulinism, like Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, which typically present with macroglossia, gigantism, exomphalos, etc. Turner syndrome that we all know. Sotos generally present with acromegaly facies and dysmorphism. And Kabuki syndrome generally present with skeletal and cardiac malformations. So coming to the first group, that is a transient congenital hyperinsulinism. The mechanism of why the perinatal stress produces congenital hyperinsulinism or transient hyperinsulinism is not very well known, but many of these cases are again attributed to dominantly active mutations in the ABCC8 or hepatic nuclear factors. Okay. The severity varies. It can be a very severe condition leading to very high glucose infusion rate requirement and very severe hypoglycemia. These conditions are mostly diazoxide sensitive and they usually resolve in days, but rarely can persist for weeks together. As some of the mutations are secondary to hepatic nuclear factor A, these babies, even after the resolution of hyperinsulinism, are at a slightly increased risk of diabetes mellitus in the later life. So that brings to our first question to you audiences. So what you think will be the role of diazoxide in transient congenital hyperinsulinism? So whether this the diazoxide is not needed in the babies as it's a transient condition and easily manageable with dextrose. B, whether it is contraindicated because of ineffectiveness and because of side effect. C, whether a proactive use is recommended or indicated in certain cases only. Probably. So you are welcome to answer. Okay, we will move on.
You have just 60 seconds to answer, last 20 seconds.
Everybody can just present their views, and I'm sure Abhishek will be able to give some presents for those who are answering all correctly.
You can see the results there. So 1/3 have answered that it's indicated in few cases. That is, majority of them have answered that it's indicated only in few cases in transient CHI, while half of them feel proactively it can be used. I think we'll listen from sir what he wants to say.
So let me again just
So your pointer is causing some square boxes.
no, that's artifact.
Boxes in the screen.
Still coming here. Sorry, I just lost the presentation.
We are able to see your screen. You can make full screen, I think.
I can find the full screen button. Somehow the full screen button is not working. Sorry for the trouble.
Can you close and restart it? That will be easy.
Yeah. Sorry for that. So let us move forward. So the answer is actually the current regulation. It is indicated only selected cases because it depends on how severe your hyperinsulinism or hypoglycemia is. Definitely, if the hypoglycemia is very severe and it is persisting more than few days of life or more than 7 days of life, most it is recommend that it is warranted to use. Though there are some studies which used it is in a proactive way also. One of was done by us only. Using diazoxide in all cases of STA babies with hyperinsulinism in the initial 5 days of life. So we included those babies who are more than 32 weeks within 5 days of life, and we proactively started diazoxide versus placebo. Obviously, the primary outcome was attainment of hypoglycemic control. And you can see that the Kaplan-Meier curve time to event analysis, those babies who received diazoxide has a faster achievement of euglycemia. You can see that they achieved euglycemia around 30-35 hours before those with placebo. The study also revealed that the hypoglycemia incidence in STA babies was something on 21%. That is slightly less than the report in the literature. But more importantly, in STA babies with hypoglycemia, around 45% had documented hyperinsulinism. This was relatively new finding, and which we should be aware about. And none of the babies had any significant side effect for hyperinsulinism. So yes, diazoxide is probably safe, but again, you need to decide upon a case-to-case basis. If the hypoglycemia is severe and persistent, then obviously you have to use the diazoxide even in transient hyperinsulinism. That leads us to the persistent congenital hyperinsulinism. Again, most of them are genetic based problems. The most common mutation is ATP sensitive potassium channels, ABCC8 and KCA gene 11. These mutations produces the most common and the most severe forms of congenital hyperinsulinism. Most of these conditions are diazoxide unresponsive, making the treatment much more difficult. They can be autosomal recessive or dominant inheritance. Generally, these babies are large for gestational age, having severe hypoglycemia and very high GR requirements or glucose infusion rate requirement. They can present as both diffuse and focal histological types. And diffuse form generally presents much earlier than the focal forms. You can see two histological slides here. The first one is the form of the diffuse form of hyperinsulinism, causing diffuse hypertrophy, diffuse hyperplasia or beta cells throughout the pancreas. You can see that some of the cells has a large nucleus, like in the right arrow. This nucleomegaly is something very characteristic of the diffuse forms. Just in a gross, you can see that this slide looks more of blue and very few red pattern either. Generally, the red color indicate the exocrine pancreatic cells, and the blue color in this slide indicate the endocrine or beta cells. In a normal pancreas, it will be the other way around, something like this. Most of the time, it will be in the red, and in between, you can see some islets of beta cells. But in diffuse form, it is reverse. This is a slide about the focal hyperinsulinism, hyperplasia of them. And you can see the normal pancreatic tissue in this other side. The other most common mutation is the glutamate dehydrogenase, the GLUT1 mutation. It's the second most common over congenital hyperinsulinism. As I already described, it produces hyperinsulinemia and hyperammonemia syndrome, HIHA syndrome. Because DDH involved in amino acids stimulated insulin release, these babies typically have a worsening of hypoglycemia whenever you give a protein load. So a fasting or protein-induced hyperinsulinism with elevated ammonia is the hallmark of this condition. Though these mutations are diazoxide responsive, but maybe because of the independent hyperammonemia, these babies have got the neurological development, neurodevelopmental risk is higher for these babies. Most of the babies tend on to develop seizures and learning disabilities, which is independent of hypoglycemia. These are the most common mutations. There are various mutations described again, but no need to go into the minute details. Coming to the histological types of congenital hyperinsulinism, there are two types. One is focal and one is diffuse. But by latest, a typical form, something a mixed kind, is also been reported, though rarely. The assignation to focal or diffuse, and the detection of focal hyperplasia or diffuse hyperplasia is important in the long-term or surgical management that we will come to later. The focal cases of congenital hyperinsulinism means the focal hyperplasia of the pancreatic beta cells. Again, due to mutations in the ABCC and KCN genes. These are generally sporadic. The lesion varies in size, but it's poorly delineated. That makes that most of the time a surgeon cannot identify these lesions macroscopically during the surgery, making the resection much trickier. Though it is a focal lesion, it is probably not a tumor. It is just an abnormal development process than a tumor. Because it is purely delimited, it has got organoid pattern, and no local invasion or no pseudocapsule can be seen. Though it can be located anywhere in the pancreas, majority are located in the head of the pancreas. Again, a summary of the genetics of focal and diffuse lesions. You can see that ABCC8 and KCN J11 can present with focal diffuse. But most of the other enzyme transporter defects and transcription pattern defects leads to diffuse forms. So that again has some implication in the treatment. Thus, when you suspect, then next point is how to diagnose a baby with hyperinsulinism. So diagnosis can be by clinical method, clinical features, then the laboratory confirmation and genetic confirmation. The clinical presentation varies. Most of the severe cases present with a large gestational age babies with a high GR requirement and hypoglycemia early in the newborn period, immediately within first 2-3 days of life itself. But the other end of the spectrum, there may be a normal weight baby with mild hypoglycemia, maybe even a transient hyperinsulinism, which is solved within few days of life. So the phenotype can vary, Mitch. But depending on the phenotype, you can somehow subclassify in some cases also, because the highest GR requirement of more than 8 or more than 10 milligram per kg per deciliter happens with all forms. That is paragonoponic of hyperinsulinism. The highest requirement be generally with potassium channel mutations. Last 4 date baby, if the baby is last 4 dates, generally these mutations or some Beckwith-Midman syndrome is more likely. If the baby is SGA, there's more chance that it may be just a perinatal stress-induced transient hyperinsulinism. If the baby have a congenital heart disease, a perinatal stress-induced or Turner or Kabuki syndromes are more probable. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a non-specific finding. Mostly happens with the severe forms of potassium ATP channel defects. So the clinical presentation in most of the cases happens in the first few days of life. Even around half of these babies present with symptomatic hypoglycemia in form of seizures. Even the baby, even it is associated with, even the baby is non-syndromic, just hyperinsulinism produces some kind of facial dysmorphism like a large forehead, larger bulbous nose, and short columella and short philtrum, and thin upper lip. But these are very non-specific findings. So again, that leads to other two questions. So what do you think if you send a critical sample that's something around, if the sugar level is less than 50 and you send a sample, if the sample doesn't show a detectable level of insulin. So can you say whether can you say that it is not a case of hyperinsulinism? Yes or no? And the other thing is when to investigate for a hyperinsulinism in newborn with hypoglycemia. Whether you have to investigate in all cases or just only refractory case of hypoglycemia, or depends on the decision to investigate purely depends on the case-to-case basis, or you need to only treat the prolonged cases of hypoglycemia, that is more than 7 days, after 7 days only. We have got 30 seconds more, I think.
Last 20 seconds.
I think most of you have answered by now, so you can stop it. So we'll go on. Yeah, Abhishek, you can continue.
No. And for the second question, we have varied answers. So most of them have answered investigation depends on severity of hypoglycemia, while some of them feel that we have to investigate every case. That is correct. The second question. But for the first question, most of them are clear that undetectable level of insulin.
So you can share back my screen. Will you stop the sharing? Somehow. Yeah, that's okay. So again, I will explain to the latest slide. So again, the first answer is yes. You cannot rule out hyperinsulinism condition because just the insulin is not detectable. I will explain in the later slides. This is a tricky question, and we cannot say that any of the answer is wrong because various authors have recommended almost all of the options as indications. There are people who recommend proactive evaluation in all cases, and there are people who do a conservative evaluation. Again, I will explain the following slides. So generally, the indication for hypoglycemia evaluation is depending on the severity of the cases or depending on the clinical features. Obviously, if the child is not able to maintain RPS more than 60 by day 3 or day 7 of life, there's a chance that it's a case of hyperinsulinism because most of the perinatal stress induced or perinatal problem related hypoglycemia settles by 72 hours of life. And if the GIR requirement is more than 8 or 10 or more, then this definitely indicates there's a high chance of hyperinsulinism. Why? Because up to a GIR requirement of 10 milligram per kg per minute, the body can compensate with other compensatory pathways like catecholamine surge, glucagon, etc. So, if the requirement is more than that, it is definitely secondary to hyperinsulinism. But in a case with who is high risk for hyperinsulinism, like LG, SGA, perinatal state, family history, GDM, or syndromic, etc., then you may investigate earlier also. So, probably a proactive investigation to looking for hypoglycemia, in every case of hypoglycemia, NICU is probably not warranted. Maybe my personal view is that it is probably too aggressive for our setting. But to say that, you need to evaluate only after 7 days of hyperglycemia is again probably not true. So you go by the baby's clinical picture. If the hypoglycemia is easy to manage and the GIR requirement is less than 10 milligram per kg per minute, that for that you have to observe for 24 to 48 hours at least, then you may leave the baby alone for maybe 4 days to 7 days. But in a high-risk baby, syndromic baby with family history, or in those risk factors for hyperinsulinism, or if the baby is having a very high GR requirement that is persisting for 24 to 48 hours, then obviously, or if the hypoglycemia is recurrent, then obviously you move forward with the investigation. The diagnostic criteria is pretty straightforward. The cardinal diagnostic criteria is when you have a plasma glucose of less than 3 millimole per deciliter or less than 50 milligram per deciliter. Ideally, you should not have any insulin detectable, but if you have a detectable insulin, serum insulin or detectable C-peptide, that seals the diagnosis of hyperinsulinism. That means it is hyperinsulinism. But the biochemical features of insulin effects are easily obtainable. A suppressed keto acid production, that beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate production, the level should be less than 1.8 micromole per liter. And a suppressed free fatty acid production, less than 0.7 micromole per liter. Again, these two are a very suggestive of hyperinsulinism. The clinical evidence of insulin effect you can see by high requirement of GIR and also a positive glycemic response to intramuscular glucagon. That is very easy to do. You just give 1 mg of IM or IV glucagon dose, and you just monitor the RBS with the glucometer every 10 minutes for next 40 minutes. But if you demonstrate a increase in the sugar value from baseline at least by 30 milligram per deciliter, that's a positive response. But if the sugar values fail to rise minimum by 20 milligram per deciliter by 20 minutes, you can stop this. You should stop the test and go on with the feeding or IV fluid. So these are the things needed for diagnosis. But sometimes the insulin level may not be detectable because insulin has got a very short lifespan, that's around 5 to 6 minutes only. And whenever there is a hemolysis or hepatic consumption, you may get a false negative report of insulin. And especially if you take time to transport into the lab or if the processing is not good, you may get a negative report for insulin. So in that condition, so whenever there is a diagnosis in doubt, you can go ahead with take the help of this supportive evidence. One is a positive glycemic response to subcutaneous dose of octreotide, a low serum levels of insulin-like growth factor binding protein, the suppressed branch chain amino acids like leucine, isoleucine, and provocation test like leucine loading or excess testing leads to will lead to manifestations of specific mutations. A normal lactic acid, normal plasma hydroxybutyryl carnitine level, and normal ammonia levels practically rules out other important causes of hypoglycemia secondary to inborn errors of metabolisms. And if you can document that a cortisol response more than 20 microgram per deciliter and a good growth hormone level, that practically rules out pan-hypopituitarism. So these are the IEMs and pan-hypopituitarism are the other DDs that can mimic the biochemical parameters of hyperinsulinism in the newborn. So whenever you send a critical sample, you look for serum insulin or C-peptide or both. Beta hydroxybutyrate and free fatty acids should be sent. And you can see the glucose sufficient rate, and ideally send a cortisol level also, just to make sure that you are not missing a case of pan-hypopituitarism. Other things you need to only check whether if you are in doubt about the diagnosis, even after this initial investigations. Coming to the management goal is pretty straightforward. Your target is I'm not sorry if somebody is asking a question. Okay, I think it's a mistake. So the diagnostic management goal is pretty straightforward. That is, we should target a plasma glucose of more than 70 milligram per deciliter even during the period of fasting. So your treatment of hyperinsulinism with drugs or other things is the aim is to achieve this goal. The treatment strategies include IV dextrose, feeding and nutritional modifications, medications, and surgery. The IV dextrose we all know how to use by peripheral or central venous catheters. The dextrose requirement, dextrose concentration needed for the maintenance GR should be provided. Feeding all these babies ideally should be fed. These babies should never be kept NPO because nil per oral status in fact aggravates the insulin, the fault in insulin control, and the hyperglycemia will get more and more refractory. So feed these babies, and nutrition modification like extra dextrose, etc., may be given as a supportive therapy. Then the medications and finally surgery. So we will deal with medications. So the brings to the other question. So there are various medications like diazoxide, octreotide, and glucagon, etc. We all use it commonly. So what do you think as not the most common but the dreaded or the most serious side effect that can happen with these drugs are? Posted it. So I hope the options are visible. The A is PH for pulmonary hypertension, NEC or necrotic migratory erythema. B is NEC for diazoxide, gallstones for octreotide, and liver dysfunction for glucagon. C is cytopenia for diazoxide, growth failure for octreotide, and NEC. So let us move forward. So the common medications used, as I already said, are diazoxide, octreotide, and glucagon, and thiazides along with diazoxide to counteract the fluid retention. Diazoxide dose is 5 to 50 milligram per kg per day, divided in 2 or 3 doses. So oral drug, hypertrichosis, fluid retention, bone marrow suppression, decreased appetite are the common side effect. Thiazides can be used concomitantly with diazoxide to prevent fluid retention. Octreotide, the dose is 2 to 20 microgram per kg per day, though sometimes may go up to 50 microgram per kg per day. As 6 to 8 hourly doses or as a continuous infusion, subcutaneous or IV. The glucagon again can be used as a rescue treatment and also for continuous infusion. It's generally well tolerated. Coming to diazoxide, as we already discussed in the pathophysiology, it opens the potassium ATP channels on beta cells. It's a first-line therapy in any case of hyperinsulinism, hyperinsulinemia, hypoglycemia. There are many authors describe the adverse effects in long-term follow-up. One of the studies by Herrera et al. One of the most common complication happens with the neutropenia and fluid retention. But generally, the neutropenia is self-limiting and thrombocytopenia also self-limiting, and again, hyperuricemia is self-limiting. Fluid retention can be easily managed with fluid requirement changes or with the thiazides if needed. Pulmonary hypertension is a dreaded complication, but happens only with a very few babies, and especially happens when you use it in preterms. Necrotizing enterocolitis can also happen with diazoxide, though when used in term babies or more than 36 weaker babies, the incidence of NEC is far low. The only case reports have been recommended. But recently also, I just reviewed a case series for pediatrics, which in which study they tried to use diazoxide in preterm population, and they reports a incidence up to 20%. Probably that's a one-off study, so you cannot generalize. But when used in preterms, there is also a risk for NEC, necrotizing enterocolitis. This is the case of hypertrichosis, a very common side effect when you use diazoxide for a long time to infancy and childhood. Somatostatin analogs are the other second most common second-line drugs used. Octreotide is the one that is available to us, though lanreotide and somatulene are long-acting ones which can be used as monthly injections and also as patches. But unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, is not available to us in our setting. The problem with somatostatin analogs of octreotide is that the tachyphylaxis, that is a unexplained loss of efficacy when you continue to use it for a few days or even for a few hours. NEC, necrotizing enterocolitis, is a definite risk. So that's why it's not a first-line drug in the first 6 to 8 weeks of life. If you increase the dose to very high, up to more than 20 micrograms per kg per deciliter, there is a chance that your hypoglycemia may worsen, because somatostatin and its analog inhibit glucagon secretion also at higher doses. So by suppressing glucagon growth hormone, a very high dose may produce a paradoxical worsening of hypoglycemia. Abdominal discomforts like diarrhea, vomiting, distension are very common, but generally settles by 1 week of use, even if you continue to use. The dose of somatostatin analog generally needs to increase depending upon the weight gain of the baby, unlike that of diazoxide. Because diazoxide, when effective, you need to change the dose of the diazoxide depending on the weight change of the baby, unless otherwise the hypoglycemia control is faulty. Again, there are various case reports, which one of them is very Demirlik, who follow up these babies on high octreotide up to 5 years, and they found that the most common side effect is liver enzyme elevation, happens till up to 50% of the babies, but again, these are asymptomatic and resolved spontaneously. Gallbladder pathology happens in a third of babies, but so these babies who are on octreotide for long time needs periodic ultrasound examination to detect gallstones at least twice a year. The duration and the side effect correlation is not much there with octreotide. The other drug is glucagon, which obviously produces a ready response in congenital hyperinsulinism. The dose, the easier one is 1 milligram per day. You just not depending on the kg per kg. It's a fixed dose of 1 milligram per day, and just give it a continuous infusion. You can give it a subcutaneous infusion also, but generally the preparation available are not that soluble and leads to catheter blockage. Generally, it is well tolerated, but off 1 or 2 baby or minority baby develops something called necrolytic migratory erythema. That's a migratory erythema, later blisters, and then leads to necrotic patches. But generally, if you stop the glucagon by then and there, it generally recovers well. There are other medications. Steroids, which we generally use in case of hypoglycemia, are unfortunately not effective in case of hyperinsulinism. Calcium channel blockers like nifedipine have limited effectiveness, so you can use it in case of treatment-resistant hyperinsulinism. Sirolimus is an immunosuppressive agent that is a agonist of mTOR receptor. Initial 1 or 2 case reports had shown a promising effect on the hyperinsulinism control, but the latest studies have not reproduced the same result, and so the evidence is pretty low. And with the all the potential risks of immunosuppression, it is not generally recommended. A high dose of polyunsaturated fatty acid and even putting the baby on ketogenic diet is helpful as adjuvant therapies, especially in a treatment-resistant case of hyperinsulinism, because you can that ketone bodies are an alternative fuel that the brain can survive on. So a ketogenic diet has got theoretical and some practical applications in selected cases. There are novel therapies have been tried, like this paper published in last year by Vajravellu and al. They tried intragastric dextrose therapy, continuous intragastric dextrose therapy. They monitored their babies for minimum 1 year. They provided a GIR up to 10 milligram per kg per minute, just like your routine calculation, just through a by a orogastric or nasogastric tube as a continuous infusion. The study shows that this therapy is well tolerated and leads to adequate weight gain. Although 1/3 of the babies had at least one episode of hypoglycemia, but that is common in any way with these babies in the long-term follow-up. So this is probably another method of glucose delivery, which is pretty practical. That's about your drugs. And diazoxide it has got some role also in the diagnostic in the diagnosis of the treatment types or diagnosis of the types of histology also. So whenever you diagnose a baby with hyperinsulinism, the first thing you need to do is to give a diazoxide responsiveness assessment. That you just start the baby on diazoxide, maybe with 5 or 10 milligram per kg per day. And if the baby is not responding by 72 hours, you increase the dose up to 15 milligram per kg per day in 3 divided doses. And once, if the baby achieved euglycemia, after 5 days of euglycemia, you give a 12-hour fasting challenge. And if the baby cannot tolerate fasting, or even with the usage of 50 milligram per kg per day, euglycemia is not achieved, that means that the baby is diazoxide non-responsive. So you can stop the diazoxide and send for ABCC8 and KCG mutations. So again, the other question, the other investigation is about a PET or DOPA, positron emission tomography. So what is the role of a PET scan in case of congenital hyperinsulinism? I think Sridhar posted it. I can't see it. Okay. So unfortunately, that is the wrong answer. Actually, it is. I will deal it in the next slide. So 18-fluoro L3 dihydroxyphenylalanine PET, or commonly known as FDOPA, fluorodopa PET, positron emission tomography. The aim is to identify focal cases of congenital hyperinsulinism secondary to potassium channel mutations. The FDOPA, fluorodopa, is a precursor for dopamine. So it has been taken up by all neuroendocrine cells. So you give DOPA, then see in imaging, and the focal area, the focal lesion will be seen as area of hyperintake. Sensitivity specificity is pretty good. When identified, it can accurately identify almost all cases. So it is indicated in those with the genetics, those babies with genetics which is consistent with the focal hyperinsulinism, that is the potassium ATP channel mutations. Also indicated in those patients with diazoxide unresponsive and genetically the genetic evaluation is not available, or genetic mutations are all negative for non-mutation in those patients also. But you need not do a PET scan in less than 1 month of life, because just to exclude the transient forms of hyperinsulinism. And also, if you already have a genetic report which shows that, which proves that it is a diffuse form, like a hyperammonemia syndrome, syndromic hyperinsulinism, and mutations in GCK, SLC, HFN, HNF, or HADH genes, etc. These mutations will anyway produce only diffuse forms. So no need to make the child undergo a unnecessary scan. So that's the way with it. The procedure is just like doing an MRI with all its difficulties. So this, if you superimpose it on the CT angiogram, you will get a very beautiful images. This is just a focal lesion in the head of the pancreas. Again, a focal lesion seen in the transverse view. Again, a focal lesion only. And here you can see that it is diffuse. The pancreas is all together bright in color, making a diffuse lesion. These two are the tracer in the kidney, so never mind this. A uptake in the tracer in the liver, the kidney, the urinary bladder, etc. are normal. This is again a pancreas which is enhanced uniformly. This is again the view of coronal view of a focal lesion, and this is a diffuse lesion. These two are the tracer in the kidney, and this is in the bladder, which is pretty normal. So the surgical treatment has got a definite role in the management for focal lesions and for diffuse lesions who have failed the medical therapy. In the focal lesions, the surgery is almost curative, but it should be done in a center with specialized center with the experienced surgeon. Because as it is macroscopically not clearly visible, the focal lesions, you may have to do a intraoperative UST or frozen sections to make the resections clear cut and the least part of resection. Diffuse forms, you have no option but to do a near total pancreatectomy. The surgical outcome, obviously, the cure rate is nearly 95% in focal lesion, but in diffuse cases, only cures are only about 25% of the previous. In focal lesions, less than 50% of resection of pancreas is usually only required, and majority still require prolonged hypoglycemia treatment for weeks or months together post surgery. After near total pancreatectomy, almost all the babies will develop exocrine and endocrine deficiency and diabetic mellitus. Median time by 8 years, but maybe by 1 or 2 decades, almost all of them develop. The outcome that we are worried about, the long-term neurodevelopmental outcome in these babies, almost all the series that documented 25 to 50% of these babies and adults have some developmental delays. This happens similarly in both focal and diffuse forms. Around 1/4, that's 20% of these patients have seizures. This neurodevelopmental adverse neurodevelopmental outcome happens also with transient hyperinsulinism. That is a concerning point. Though we had made much improvement, advancement in the treatment methods over the last 2 decades, but the outcomes are not very drastically different over the 5 decades. So one case in which you can see that severe hypoglycemia leading to occipital, severe occipital injury and cyst formation. Various others are documented abdominal development from 25 to 48%, depending on the various studies. So coming to a concise management algorithm, once you diagnose the case of congenital hyperinsulinism, you give a diazoxide response trial. If the baby is diazoxide responsive, that is sustaining a response by diazoxide dose of 10 or less milligram per kg per day, you just continue with the medical therapy. But if it is partially responsive only, or it is unresponsive, you go and do about a genetic analysis. So again, the genetic analysis need not be done in all cases of congenital hyperinsulinism. If the baby is pretty much diazoxide sensitive and easily manageable, you can wait up till 6 months of life for his complete spontaneous resolution. But if the baby is not requiring by 6 months of life, then again a genetic analysis is warranted in that case. In other ways, if the baby is diazoxide unresponsive, proactively do a genetic analysis, a specific mutation analysis, or preferably a next generation sequencing is a better. So then you will get genetic diagnosis. So if you have a mutation that which shows that which implies it is a diffuse lesion, just continue with the medical therapy. If the mutation status is uncertain, or if you just have mutation over the potassium channel, ABCC or KCN, then you have to do a fluorodopa PET to rule out, to diagnose the case of focal lesions. In case of focal lesions, you go ahead and do the focal lesionectomy. In case of diffuse lesions, you continue with medical therapy, and by maximum drugs and maximum fluid and feed modification, if the child is still unresponsive, then ultimately go and do a subtotal pancreatectomy in these babies. So that comes to the last question of us. What do you people think about the natural history of a congenital hyperinsulinism, which is a confirmed case secondary to genetic mutations, like a potassium channel defect? So you have baby with a genetically confirmed potassium channel defect. So what do you think will happen in the long term for these babies? Whether it will resolve in majority of cases, or whether it is a permanent condition, or whether resolution is documented in few cases or not. I hope you can see the options. Yeah. Option A is it is a permanent and lifelong condition. Option B is permanent, but severity decreases or varies according with ages. C is spontaneous resolution is known.
Option D.
Majority permanent. Okay. So actually the answer is option C. So no need to be so pessimistic with babies with congenital hyperinsulinism. That's a plus point that I had to highlight, because I just presented one of the case series. There are many case series who have been described by Solomon et al. They followed the 21 babies with confirmed potassium channel mutations till adulthood, and in 71%, on the majority of cases, spontaneous resolution happened. Though maybe it took years to resolution, but it did happen. And even in diazoxide responsive cases, 100% our spontaneous resolution happened. Even in diazoxide unresponsive cases, 57% had shown spontaneous resolution. This has been reproduced by various others also in various case series. Though these babies had development delays as expected, the type of gene mutation does not predict persistence. So that's why in all cases of hyperinsulinism, especially in diffuse cases, you go on with the medical therapy and just hope for resolution. But once you reach a state that you cannot manage it medically, then only go for total pancreatectomy. So the ATP channel mutation reduction in severity in hyperinsulinism over time occurs in most of the babies. In around 50%, complete resolution occurs. But even after resolution, some of the babies are at risk of diabetes mellitus. So that way they swing from the hypoglycemia of a newborn to hyperglycemia in the early adult life. Some mutations especially put the child or the patient at risk of maturity onset diabetes in the following age. The mechanism responsible deceleration is, we don't know yet, but the fact remains that most of them resolve over time. Even those babies with transient hyperinsulinism, they can later on develop ketotic hypoglycemia and also diabetes mellitus. This ketotic hypoglycemia in later childhood should not be mistaken as a recurrence of hyperinsulinism, because hyperinsulinism was a non-ketotic hypoglycemia. Again, this ketotic hypoglycemia generally easily manageable and resolves over time. The other question remains, whenever the parents have a child with hyperinsulinism, what is the recurrence chance in the other sibling? When you have genetic study available, easier. For de novo mutation, 0 is the chance of recurrence. If you have focal form, again, almost 0 is the chance of recurrence, because focal forms are generally sporadic. they do not form maintenance recurrence. The diffuse form has, if it is autosomal recessive mutation 25% and autosomal dominant mutation 50% risk. If you do not have any genetic test done, and if you have, as I've said, unresponsive cases, just assume a empirical risk of 25 to 50% and counsel accordingly. Future therapies, soluble glucagon is available in adult medicine, probably will get it. Specific insulin receptor allosteric antibodies are in trial. Alternate drug targets like glucagon-like peptides are in trial. Alternate agonist for SSRIs like paclitaxel is again in trial. Development of chaperones that assist trafficking of potassium ATP channels is again on trial. Probably we'll get better therapies in the future. So, like with that positive note, let me thank you. And if you have any questions,